Hi, my name is Avery Mascoll, a student of the Indiana Wesleyan University, and I am going to do a presentation for you today on fiduciary duty and corporate social responsibility. Firstly, I'm going to provide some definitions for you for fiduciary duty and then corporate social responsibility. Fiduciary duty defined, and I like to think about it into two components. One, the fiduciary duty, which is essentially the obligation that a party has to take care of the responsibilities and the interest of another party. And the second part is actually the duty to execute on their behalf. And in the business context, we have duty of care, which essentially means that you are actually going to be doing work or diligence competently on behalf of the person or the business in which you represent. And then there's a duty of loyalty, which means, for example, you're not just prioritizing your own personal interest, but you're considering the interest as well of the person that you're acting on behalf of. Then as well, you have the whole issue of duty of good faith and good dealings, which means that you must be honest and you must do it in such a way that the beneficiary gets the best interest out of it. And then the necessity and the duty for disclosure, which speaks about providing the necessary information that is required for persons to make prudent decisions. And an example now of fiduciary duty and example of that is where a financial advisor has to act on behalf of their client or on behalf of their colleague. In this case, the financial advisor may be a risk taker and may desire to make one particular decision if it were their own. However, in terms of acting on behalf of the interest of another and subduing personal interest, it is their responsibility to act on behalf of the client and make sure that the decision is suited to the action that they require. So that's part of fiduciary duty and responsibility. And in the case of corporate social responsibility, the European Union has a definition which speaks to responsibility for enterprises to act on behalf of their society. And when I think about their definition, that provides two components. One, the responsibility of an enterprise to act and impact society, which means that there must be consideration of how businesses act in the space in which they work and consider the impact that they have as well. So when we consider that, some persons will define it according to Correll in his work. He would have defined it in a number of dimensions, and he refers to the pyramid of CSR, or corporate social responsibility. And his definition speaks to the whole element of economic responsibility, which means that there must be profit and the value must be added on behalf of the stakeholders. However, that must be done within a legal responsible framework for those that will be impacted. So for example, they must obey the laws and regulations within the jurisdiction or jurisdictions in which they perform. Consideration must also be as well for ethical responsibility, meaning you must do what is right. It must be fair and it must be in compliance with the necessary frameworks that are there. So that's also the component of ethics. And then philanthropic responsibility. You must give back to the betterment of the community in which you serve. So what they are trying to do with corporate social responsibility is to make sure that the entity or entities or enterprises act in a manner that also benefits the society in which they function. And in this case, I would have developed an example, and I came up with this business by the name of AV Motors. And we're going to do a case study on AV Motors, evaluating their fiduciary duty as well as their corporate social responsibility. So if we summarize the case, AV Motors is an American company, a manufacturer. They also produce and distribute, but they're also a global company as well. And they have two technologies which they launch. One, a lightweight composite body, as well as what they call a smart shell impact system, which is an AI-based substitute for airbags. So the company is revolutionary in terms of the way in which it works and the contribution that it makes to industry. And because of that, the company has been growing. While the company has been growing, there are still concerns, and that we will review right now. The first, technical. Despite acknowledging the structural issues of the body in extreme weather, there were still concerns as well about the smart shell technology and its failures in certain conditions. But leadership of AV Motors continued to release the product despite knowing that there were technical challenges. Insider trading. So after a series of accidents, a number of board members would have actually shed loads of stock and sold large amounts of stock at the time in a company that was growing. For them, they had inside information because they knew that serious accidents had taken place and the information was not published. And they took that to their advantage and sold stock. And insider trading was also a concern that was seen within the company. There were also environmental concerns as well. So lithium is actually part of the production of batteries for the EV component of the car. And they source products from Western Australia. But they were found to be engaged in a company that actually has damaging environmental practices. And they failed to do anything about that. The implications of technical matters, the implications of insider trading, the implications of environmental issues, they all essentially impacted customer trust, and the company is now facing class action suits because of greenwashing and corporate negligence. So if we evaluate the company in further detail, we want to determine what breaches of fiduciary duties took place within this organization. And before I say that, we have a number of key actors. For example, the CEO, who's a former automotive engineer for 25 years. We have Emily Parker, who is a CFO. She has been an executive in Fortune 500 companies for several years. We have Mike Haynes, an MIT graduate, also responsible for significant developments within the industry. And Linda Walker, who has a doctorate from Harvard University in terms of sourcing and sustainable development. So the entire leadership of the organization is extremely experienced. And when we evaluate, for example, the CEO's contribution, his failed duty of care essentially because he suppressed the release of reports that would have given key information to speak about the organization's failure to execute and the lack of readiness to produce a product that was ready for market. They also breached loyalty because they were prioritizing short-term interests rather than long-term success. That was a fiduciary breach of the CEO, John Montgomery. Emily Parker, in her case, as a financial party responsible, she was supposed to be the person who says, you know what, here are these exposures, here's a financial risk, here's a long-term risk, and at least let investors be aware that these are concerns and be transparent with the disclosure. So here was a duty of care issue as well as a duty to disclose that was not honored. Mike Haynes as well, he now is a technocrat at the highest level and would have been responsible for partially designing some of these systems that were being implemented by AV Motors. The interesting part about his contribution is that he knew they would not have met the requirements. And rather than sounding the alarm and blowing the whistle in good faith to ensure that the stakeholders' interest was taking place, he did not take action and supported the activity of launching knowingly that there were breaches in terms of performance of safety. And in the case of Linda Walker, she is a chief sustainability officer, and there was no oversight in terms of sourcing and auditing the sourcing regimes, and essentially an ethical practice with respect to material supply was actually happening and was not addressed at a board or a company level. And as it speaks to the board, who is responsible for the strategic operations of the entire organization, they have failed to ensure that the product was safe. They allowed the suppression of reporting and the sale of stock due to inside information. There are complete failures of duty of care, loyalty, and good faith. Balancing corporate social responsibility. So to balance corporate social responsibility, it would require the integration of corporate social means into the business strategy as a primary level activity, which would then influence the way decisions are made with regards to sourcing, with regards to transparency of reporting. For example, CSR was actually not primary, and hence the decision making was flawed at its primary source. Another way to balance corporate social responsibility is to ensure that supply contracts have terms written in and service level agreements that become enforceable so that parties acting on behalf of AV Motors would actually be upholding a responsibility. Clearly written supply contracts would also help with balancing the corporate social responsibility and establishing an agreed framework with service level agreements which can also become enforceable. In addition, balancing corporate social responsibility also requires risk management. It establishes a framework to assess auditing and different ways of working within finance, within environmental circumstances, and the manufacturing processes, which would allow for both mitigation and control. And that should have been a proactive measure being implemented within AV Motors. So, in summary, failure to report or remedy or to deal with these concerns essentially allow them to maintain a relationship with an unethical supplier is clearly not justifiable and could have been prevented. So the question is, what alternate actions could have been taken? For example, the CEO, Mr. John Montgomery, could have prioritized transparency by ensuring that all the reports are open and that immediate action is taken to mitigate any fallout as a result of publishing unsafe equipment into market. Also, he had the responsibility and the authority to ensure that a necessary extension is given so that the corporate social responsibility as well as the fiduciary duties of all stakeholders could have been met. With respect to the CFO, Ms. Parker, it is her responsibility to have spoken about the long-term risk about not communicating these issues. For example, the costs or suspected costs as a result of failing to do what we're supposed to do is a financial risk. And she has a responsibility to be a stakeholder management and whistleblower on behalf of the stakeholders as well. And in terms of the chief technical officer, it is his responsibility to make sure that equipment failures do not occur and to communicate updated schedules and actions to ensure that all necessary frameworks are mitigated. These are alternative actions to make sure that testing is done in a manner that allows for safe implementation. Linda Walker, who is responsible for sourcing and procurement, auditing would have been a major alternative action that could have been taken. Where are the materials coming from? How are they being used? And also diversification would have been an important part as well of suppliers. So if there's a possible issue, you have alternatives so that the business continuity can take place. So these are all alternate actions. And with respect to the board, it is their responsibility to ensure that corporate governance procedures align and guarantee that audits and guarantee that safety cultures are created in an organization to ensure that the actions of the staff and the company also protect its stakeholders and its customers. The effects on stakeholders. So there are many stakeholders, for example, vendors and suppliers. Once there's an industry-wide issue, then there's a cost incurred to manage the image of those other actors in the industry as well. So not only is the key supplier impacted, but also other suppliers of lithium would also be impacted because of the environmental policy and enforcement regimes that will continue to follow because the industry is now under scrutiny. Every stakeholder in an organization that is long-term will have some element of exposure. And in this case, there would be an impact due to possible loss and fines and also damage. And as a result of all of these, there will be investigations, both in the short and the long term, which then impacts the viability of the company. In the case of employees, risk tolerance as a safety culture is definitely unethical. And that could be a habit that is fostered in the organization. In addition, it would also impact the ability of the organization to have a culture that is non-toxic, because behaviors will support unethical, unsafe practices, and risk tolerance is a major effect on stakeholders and employees. Also, the increase of uncertainty because of the likely collapse of the business would also impact employee uncertainty. And as a result, they will not produce like they should be. Motivation levels will be low within the organization. Environmental damage would also be an impact. The ecosystems, water systems, and animals, and the community at large, and the indigenous people, they may have to be removed because of environmental concerns and lose their whole identity in terms of relation to the place of origin where they were born. Consequences of failure. Liability issues definitely will be a problem. Product liability, and that would impact customers. Class action suits will actually come out of it because of their failure to address safety issues with the shell of the vehicles, as well as their technology. And also there will be fines based on the Federal Trade Commission and the environmental regulatory commissions as well for malpractices through sourcing. Also, there will be financial penalties that based on non-compliance, failure to actually protect the environment. The Environmental Protection Agency in the US will also come after them, as well as the Australian authorities. The Australian Competition and Consumer Protection Agencies will all be going after AV Motors as a result of penalties for non-compliance with respect to sourcing and failure to settle issues that are required. Damaged trust and reputation will also be a consequence of failure. For example, these types of issues bring up public relation matters. And of course, environmental concerns, brand issues, and the media will always impact them. And they would result in customer boycotts, which are major to the business. So there will be damage of reputation, and reputational damage is very, very hard to rebuild. You have to now regain their trust. It takes more effort to regain trust than it does to lose it. You lose trust in an instant, but loyalty is built over time. The inability to continue doing business in the US will also be an impact. If you violate standards, there can be sanctions placed on you for not following laws, and can trigger restricted business, can trigger sanctions due to money and how money is done, as well as the impact in the Australian region as well, where there could be other locations also that you want to export to, that they may also put down stringent laws to ensure that you are not able to continue or to start doing business in new territories. Another consequence of failure is the difficulty to attract investors. Once investor confidence is lost, it is hard to regain. In addition, there will definitely be operational and moral issues. So talent planning, talent retention, being able to attract talent of the highest caliber will no longer be there, and there are likely impacts due to employee turnover, and talent acquisition will be challenged. Future scrutiny and audits. When a company has a reputation that's destroyed, the microscope will be turned on them, which means that there will be increased oversight over their business practices and their ethical practices as well. So in reflection, here are some key elements that I found that was interesting. One, negligence is an issue. Failing to take corrective action is actually a breach of fiduciary responsibility. And in addition, you can prioritize personal gain or short-term gains and forego safety, which is a balancing act. So you could find that fiduciary responsibilities could become intention, but the responsibility of leadership is to balance every responsibility that they're given. There could also be conflicts between fiduciary responsibility and corporate social responsibility. For example, the matter of short-term gains and the whole issue of sourcing. You have to make sure that you take both the fiduciary responsibility as well as the corporate social responsibility and intertwine them into the fabric of decision making. Another reflection is the necessity of auditing. It is important to have a goal to be a profitable company. But if you do not have systems to audit the way business is executed, the potential for malpractice is very high. And finally, I want to say that risk management is critical, and it should be a proactive measure implementing into decision making to assist balancing the weight of fiduciary responsibilities as well as corporate social responsibilities. So to understand fiduciary duty, the decision, and to balance the corporate social responsibility determines the impact. And that is part of the responsibility of any leader in an organization to ensure its fiduciary as well as corporate social responsibility is well maintained to a high standard. And the references are here below, taken for the definitions as well as to provide context to the work being executed. Thank you.